Well, great. Thank you very much for that introduction. One of the themes of the last session was that we need to engage the social sciences to a greater degree, and we've been doing that in the IPCC. And I'd like to talk now a little bit about what we've learned from the IPCC experience about how to go forward on policy design and on international cooperation. I'm going to make a few remarks that are based on the IPCC report, but you don't actually see most of these findings stated as crisply as I will hopefully state them in the summary document, and that's because the summary document goes through the process that Pachari mentioned, which is it requires review and consent by governments down to individual words, and that process has a tremendous strength, and it gets buy-in, and if you see something in the synthesis report, you know there's a tremendous amount of confidence around that statement. But it also means that as we move from the hard sciences into the social sciences, which to a greater degree implicate what individual governments might do, how people might behave, that it's harder to get agreement. And so some of the most profound insights in the scientific literature that are reviewed by the IPCC are actually deep in the reports and have a hard time making their way into the summary documents, and in a couple of cases have been so radioactive politically, I think that's the technical term, that we've actually had to delete a couple of figures. And I want to show you those, not for purposes of criticizing the IPCC process, but for purposes of helping us understand how to read these reports and read and understand what the social science community is saying about how we go forward. I want to say 5 things during my remarks. And the first one is, everyone always says, be optimistic, identify opportunity, hug everyone else, and that's great. But I just want to underscore that one of the central messages, especially from Working Group 3 of the report, is that although we have been talking a lot about climate policy, and we have been going to lots of meetings and negotiating lots of agreements, you see that everywhere in the travel schedules of the diplomats. You do not see that in the data on emissions. Emissions are rising more rapidly in the last decade than any other decade since 1970. They've reached their highest level, and we've seen, in fact, extraordinary growth in the recent year. This is a chart that I borrowed from Glenn Peters, and the Global Carbon Project is a terrific group of folks doing a tremendous amount of analysis. Historical data shown in the solid black line on the left over time. Emissions of just from fossil fuels and cement. That's because we have greater confidence in these data, and we can update them more rapidly. What you see are the black line, the historical data going up. Here's the estimate for what it'll be in the year 2014, and then this fan of color are the range of all the different scenarios into the future. We are tracking perfectly the highest conceivable scenarios for future emissions. And I guess that's a sign that the scientific community is doing a good job of projecting future emissions. It's not a good sign in terms of actual emissions policies around the world. It used to be that we were actually tracking above, and then we revised upward the highest possible scenario so that now we're tracking perfectly with that. There are a lot of reasons why we so far have been good at talking about climate policy, but in most countries, Norway is an exception, Europe is an exception more generally, most countries we haven't actually made a lot of progress. Some of this is that exogenous factors drive emissions, and that those factors are hard to change, at least over short time periods. So this is another way of looking at the data that was presented in the first panel this morning. The single largest reason for the rise in emissions, rapid rise in emissions in the last decade, has been economic growth. And in particular economic growth from the emerging economies dominated by China. This is a chart that is in the IPCC report but got removed from the final summary because it did the audacious thing of dividing the world into the 4 major socioeconomic categories. The high-income countries shown here on the top in the yellow, the upper middle-income countries, including the emerging economies, China and other rapidly growing economies shown in the orange, lower middle-income countries and the least developed countries. The basic pattern this reveals is that essentially all the growth in emissions is coming from the upper middle-income countries. And the reason this was so controversial is that this then implies that those countries should be taking on more commitments, something that is happening right now but is politically one of the most contested aspects of the negotiations leading into Paris. One of the reasons we haven't made a lot of progress is that we have focused historically on policy instruments that are designed to generate high levels of compliance but almost no actual impact on behavior. The Kyoto Treaty is a great example of this. Back in 1997, this chart shows you in the year 1997, in the year 2010, and then more recently, shows you the fraction of world emissions that are covered by the Kyoto Treaty. There's an appendix in the back of the treaty that lists the countries that agreed to cut their emissions and the targets to which they've cut. In the Doha meeting, that was extended out to the year 2020, and some countries signed up for that extended period. Back in 1997, the Kyoto Agreement was set up to only regulate the emissions of the advanced industrialized countries. And you might say, well, that's not great, but at least it's a start. And at the time, that was about 60% of world emissions. If you look at the countries that actually ratified the Kyoto Treaty and stayed inside as a matter of international law, so that means excludes the United States, because when the United States got to the point where it wanted to ratify the treaty, it was impossible technically to comply with the treaty at that point because U.S. emissions had grown so much. It didn't help that our president at the time was George W. Bush, who was not a great fan of international institutions either. But the underlying reality was there was no technical scenario by which we could comply. And so there's no way the U.S., as a matter of law, could have ratified. Canada ratified, but then withdrew because its largest trading partner in the United States didn't join the treaty. And so you ended up with only 23% of world emissions actually included in the Kyoto Treaty when it entered into force. The rest of the emissions from the rest of the world grew, and so what you have is a shrinking pie, a shrinking amount of actual regulatory effort being covered by this treaty. So this helps explain why we've worked a lot on the problem, and we've produced agreements that appear symbolically to actually have an impact, but actually have not made much of an impact. We say this in the report. You can imagine that we don't say this in the summary document that requires a line-by-line approval from governments. I make this point not to be pessimistic, but to be realistic about the profound change in negotiating strategy and policy strategy that is going to be needed to make progress on the problem. I'm actually more optimistic about this than I have been in a long time because I see those changes now happening in the negotiations leading up to Paris. Many more countries involved, including countries that previously abhorred the idea of international commitments like Brazil and China in particular. Lots of small groups getting involved in various ways, such as the deal announced yesterday between the United States and China. Tremendous number of small group efforts led, I think the single most important one, the best example for the world is actually what Norway has led on forests, tremendously valuable. Initiatives like the Climate and Clean Air Coalition focused on short-lived climate pollutants. So you see a lot of activity, but it's not top-down, it's decentralized and chaotic and experimental, and the trick for the negotiators is going to be to try and put all this stuff together into some kind of an umbrella that makes sense on the road to Paris a year or so from now. The second thing of the 5 things I want to say concerns goals. This morning, and there's a lot of talk about 2 degrees, we should stop warming at 2 degrees, and 2 degrees is not, a happy world. 2 degrees is rough. In particular, 2 degrees is rough for nature. The largest impacts of climate change are going to be on unmanaged natural ecosystems, and lots of people in different ways value those natural ecosystems, and they do not adapt in the same way that humans, who are forward-looking creatures, can adapt to impacts on climate change. Pachari suggested this morning there's going to be a big debate between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. I think the debate's going to be different. I think the debate is going to be about the feasibility of 2 degrees altogether, because there is simply no scenario that I see as an analyst who's worked in this area for a long time. There is no realistic scenario by which the 2-degree target is actually achievable. It is simply impossible. And we've got to grapple with that reality and start setting goals that are better connected to what we can actually achieve, because goals that have no relationship to what we can achieve are goals that ultimately don't have much of an impact on the actual underlying political processes that we're trying to inspire here. You might say, well, but the IPCC said that 2 degrees is feasible. And we did say 2 degrees is feasible. This is a chart from the report that shows historical emissions since 1850, solid black lines, various scenarios looking out into the future. The gray scenarios are the business as usual scenarios. Those are the ones that we're actually on right now. They see 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century. Then you have a variety of scenarios here, the yellow scenarios and the blue scenarios, which make sufficiently deep reductions in emissions that we have a decent chance, a better than 50-50 chance, of stopping warming at 2 degrees. And this is an area where I think we have somewhat misled the public as to the feasibility of goals. And that's because we have reported that it is feasible to stop warming at 2 degrees, but we have not reported fully and accurately, or we have allowed people to overlook the fact that there's a variety of assumptions in the models that deliver 2 degrees. Those assumptions in particular are that all technologies are available instantly globally, all countries cooperate effectively globally almost immediately, and that particular technologies that make deep cuts in emissions, like carbon capture and storage, or bioenergy carbon capture and storage, which has negative emissions, that those technologies become available very, very quickly and are widely diffused. That is not correct. And Norway knows this because Norway's own experience with carbon capture and storage, a world leader, it has been tremendously expensive. And so if you imagine the scenario by which real countries and real firms do the business case for, do I invest in a technology that is fantastically expensive and risky and is not being widely used, real firms aren't doing that. And that's what we see almost everywhere in the world. So we need to start to look more closely at the realm of the scientific research that has been working at so-called second best scenarios. So this is a chart from the IPCC that begins to report some of what's going on in the scientific community. We used to report almost all scenarios coming out of these models that were best scenarios, meaning least cost. The models identified the optimal pathway for making a reduction in emissions. And if you tell a model you have 100 years to identify an optimal pathway, almost any model can do almost anything, especially if you give it the most charitable assumptions. What the modelers are now doing a very good job on, and this is the most interesting area of the social science research, I think, is identifying ways that the real world's going to intrude on those optimal scenarios. Least cost scenarios are not plausible, but scenarios where there are restrictions on some technologies like nuclear power or carbon capture and storage and so on, where firms see that it's risky to invest in some technologies and not others, and so they avoid those riskier investments, at least initially, until those are demonstrated. That we're now starting to be able to represent in the models. And what you see almost always, not always, but what you see almost always is that when you compare those scenarios against least cost scenarios, the costs are much higher, the emissions reductions occur more slowly, goals like 2 degrees become infeasible. So for example, this is a chart that shows for scenarios that would more likely than not reduce emissions, temperatures to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial level, and scenarios that are roughly 50-50. What happens if you limit carbon capture and storage technologies, or what happens if you limit bioenergy, which is a very attractive way to reduce carbon emissions, especially in the transport sector. And relative to baseline, shown here as 1, what you see is a huge explosion in expected costs and a big slowdown in the rate at which we can actually reduce these emissions. Those are the parts of the IPCC report when you want to talk about politically feasible, realistic scenarios where I think we should be paying attention. The third of the 5 things I want to talk about concerns what we've learned in the IPCC process about instruments, policy instruments, what works best, and what should countries be doing. And here there's a big disconnect between what we love as economists and what we learn about in Economics 101, which is to use markets whenever possible. Use emissions taxes. I happen to think taxes are a better strategy than trading because of the way uncertainty gets managed in the tax system, but if you're not going to use taxes, use an emissions trading scheme. Use markets. There's a disconnect between that advice and what almost every government does when it gets serious about addressing a problem, which is it uses direct regulation. And the reason that direct regulation is so attractive is because in many countries it's administratively easier and it's politically much easier to manage, because direct regulation allows you to hide the cost of what you're really doing and shift the cost from well-organized, politically well-organized groups to less well-organized groups, which are usually taxpayers and consumers and so on. The kind of basic law of politics is that politics is about shifting rents and activities from well-organized groups to less well-organized groups. That's the art of politics, and it's an ugly art, but it's an art that gets things done. And regulation allows you to do that much more readily than market-based instruments, because one of the reasons we as analysts love market-based instruments is because they are transparent. They make it clear what's actually going on. I know that Europe has had this experience with the emissions trading scheme, where what you have is actually a market-based system layered on top of an existing regulatory system. And one of the reasons that the prices are low in the emissions trading scheme in Europe has been that the other mechanisms are having a really big impact on emissions, and so what's left over for the trading scheme to do is relatively small. What we see, I'll show you an example from California. California has an emissions trading scheme, the most interesting one in the United States right now. What we see in California, this chart shows, this is from the California Air Resources Board, which is the group that manages that trading scheme. It shows the estimated reduction in emissions that will be needed from the level in 2020, shown on the very top left here, to the level in 2020 that we need to get to. Of the reduction in emissions, what are the different policy instruments that are going to contribute to that reduction? What you see up here is cap and trade is about 1/5 of that total. So when people look at California and they say California is now adopting an emissions trading scheme and using markets and they love markets and they're showing us the way, it is in fact a complete lie. Because our trading system is a layer, a veneer, on top of what is actually a regulatory system. Requirements to buy renewable power, requirements for energy efficiency, and so on. And the regulatory system is what's actually doing most of the work. And in the underlying IPCC report, not so much in the summary for policymakers, we talk a lot about the interaction between these policy instruments. This is a very important point of political realism coming out of the IPCC, because if we're going to look at how real governments adopt policies, we're going to need to pay attention to the interactions between different policy instruments. One of the implications from this is that governments aren't going to know exactly what they can deliver when they make promises in Paris and beyond. And so we need legal agreements that are flexible enough to accommodate this uncertainty. And if we do not allow them to be flexible, if we require them to be very strict and very legally binding, then what governments will do is what they did in Kyoto, which is reduce the level of promises they make so they can be sure they can comply. But what we want to encourage is exactly the opposite. We want to have countries make the biggest promises possible and make as much effort as possible, but give them some flexibility. The fourth of the 5 things I want to talk a little bit about is the point of globalization. I want to make just one point, which is that globalization has profoundly changed the opportunity for reducing emissions, and mostly for the good. It is now possible to test carbon capture and storage technologies in China, where it costs half to build a CCS power plant than it would in the United States, and probably 1/3 than it would in Europe, and learn lessons from the Chinese experience and then travel them around the world. And that's one of the things that I found most exciting about the announcement yesterday between the United States and China, is those demonstration projects will be going ahead. But globalization has also made the job of negotiating agreements much harder, because it is so easy to move goods and services, and especially energy-intensive goods, around the world economy, that the amount of emissions embodied in those goods that are moving across borders, those emissions embodied, are rising over time. So if you look, for example, at Britain, which is very proud that it's reduced its emissions 30% below 1990 levels, 2/3 of that achievement actually came from the fact that they have outsourced a very large fraction of energy-intensive activities to other economies, and the emissions are basically happening in those other countries. We had a chart. This came out of the IPCC report. This is one of those charts that was politically very, very difficult for governments to accept in the final summary, because it has direct policy implications. This chart shows for each of those 4 income groups that I mentioned earlier, what's the fraction of trade that is embodied, of emissions that are embodied in international trade. There's a very simple implication from this, which is the countries that are doing the most on climate change need to start threatening and then implementing adjustments at the border to correct for this and to create the right incentives, so that then other countries will start to see an incentive to make reductions on their own. If we do not do that, then countries, China, the United States, others, will have a strong incentive to avoid climate commitments, because they will gain an economic advantage from that. What Europe has been doing on airlines is the first step in this, and I have applauded it enormously, and every airline company has hated it. And keep doing that. Yes, please keep doing this. Please keep annoying the large emitters in this respect, because while the trade lawyers are going to be worried about the impact of this on the trading system, there's no way to get the underlying incentives right if we don't correct this imbalance that's being created by the globalization of the world economy. And the last thing I'll say, and then close, concerns political viability. The reason I'm optimistic now, after being pessimistic for several decades, is that there's a lot more attention to international agreements that are lined up with what countries are willing and able to do on their own. 2 examples very quickly. One is the so-called issue of co-benefits. The IPCC, we spent a lot of time on this in the last report. Somebody asked the question, what's new? This is one of the areas that's very new, where we've looked at the impact on black carbon and on sulfur dioxide. I'll focus on black carbon. Black carbon's a major killer, soot, big cause of respiratory disease, crop failures, and a variety of other ailments. And Norway is currently co-chair of the big international initiative on black carbon and other short-lived climate pollutants. The big push in this area is great, because even if a country like China doesn't care very much about long-term global warming, they do care an awful lot about immediate air pollution. And so we want to find ways initially to rebuild the credibility of these international institutions by getting countries to work on things that they care about for selfish reasons, and then have the spillover of also contributing to the global climate. And the last thing I'll say is the other area where I'm very encouraged is that we have stopped talking about the issue of climate change entirely through the lens of global, multilateral United Nations agreements. The global multilateral system has a role to play, but it is prone to gridlock for all the reasons that Pachari mentioned. One country in an IPCC plenary can disrupt progress for a very long period of time. And some countries involved in these negotiations do not want these negotiations to be successful. Saudi Arabia is in the carbon exporting business. This is not a good program for Saudi Arabia's self-interest. So they're going to block progress. And in the IPCC plenary in April, I spent a huge amount of time dealing with the Saudis and a handful of other countries that were upset about this. We need to find ways to move around those blockers. And one way to do that is to move from big global agreements to lots of smaller agreements, like what was announced yesterday between the United States and China. Make progress in small groups, and then you stitch it together, bottom up, if you like, rather than top down. And that can make a big difference, because CO2 emissions, this is a rank order plot. Only 10 or 12 countries account for 70 or 80% of world CO2 emissions, so you can make a lot of progress starting with these small clubs. It's a fragmented system. It's a system that will require from Paris an umbrella agreement that helps to stitch some of those small agreements back together again. It's a slow process too, and it's a reminder that real policy in this area is going to unfold much more slowly than our aggressive scenarios, our 2.6 scenarios and so on in the IPCC that seem like it's feasible to stop warming at 2 degrees. We're going to turn the corner, I think, this year. But we're going to turn the corner, we're going to be working on this problem slowly, and we need to brace ourselves for a lot more than 2 degrees. Thank you very much.